In my previous video about free will and non-duality, I talked in more general terms, but I didn't really comment on one particular topic, and that's what I want to talk about here. And that topic is, why do people deny that we have free will? More specifically, why do people who are open to non-duality, why do they deny that we have free will? And this is one of those topics that is a really good illustration of what I've been trying to say in the previous videos. And that is very simply, you cannot really grasp non-duality unless you understand duality and the duality consciousness. If you do not understand how the duality consciousness colors everything you see, the way you look at life, then you cannot reach a state of non-duality. And this is the big lack in most teachings about non-duality. They just focus on the non-dual state, but don't really pay much attention to the dualistic state. So let's take a look at how the duality consciousness affects our view of free will. And specifically, how the duality consciousness makes people deny that we have free will. Because if you're not in a state of duality, you experience that you have a will. You have an ability to make choices. You are making choices. As I said, you have two states of consciousness you can be in on Earth. You can see yourself as a connected being. You can see yourself as a separate being. When you experience yourself as a connected being, you are experiencing that you are a co-creator, you are connected to your higher self, to the spiritual beings in a higher realm, and you experience that you are experimenting with your co-creative abilities by making choices. It's not a theory, it's not something you believe. You don't believe that you have free will, you experience. Yes, you can say, my will, my ability to make choices is limited by my current level of awareness, and I realize I am in a process of raising my sense of self, transcending my sense of self, and the more I transcend my current sense of self, the more free my will becomes. So you're not necessarily, you have total free will, but you realize that you are growing by making choices and seeing the consequences. That's an experience, it's not a belief. However, when you go into duality, you tend to deny free will, but that's not an experience, that's a belief. That's a concept you have created in your mind, and as I have said now several times, when you go into duality, you think your mind is complete. It's a self-validating system. The way you look at it must be true. You have elevated some viewpoint to an absolute truth. And this is what many people have done with these concepts of non-duality, as I've said that any kind of differentiation is a duality and should be overcome. But let's step back a little bit. What I have said about the duality consciousness is that it causes you to create a sense of identity based on the illusion that you are a separate being. You are separated from your physical environment, from other people, and from your source in the spiritual realm. And the extreme outcome of this is that you attempt to create a separate self that's so sophisticated, so advanced in your own mind, according to your own standard, that it'll become immortal, or one day God has to allow it into heaven. I explained why this is in my video about how the world was created, how the world works series. And you can look at it there where I go into more detail about it. But what I want to talk about here is this. There are some beings who have taken free will to the absolute extreme of trying to create this God-like separate self. Now, as I've tried to explain, the moment you go into duality, the duality consciousness, the sense of self you have is based on an illusion, or rather many illusions. So their quest is impossible, it can never happen. But because of the law of free will, they are allowed to take this very, very far, because eventually they will come to the point where they've had enough of it, give up on it, and start working their way back to being connected beings. So that's why this is allowed within the law of free will. But what we have to recognize is that the Earth is one of the planets in the universe where these beings have been allowed to influence the planet. So there are these kind of beings, very dualistic beings, in physical embodiment. There are some in the emotional realm, some in the mental realm, and some in the identity realm. And they have profoundly influenced Earth for a very, very long time. Certainly in recorded history. And this means that they have attempted to use any idea whatsoever to further their own ends, their own goals. And what are their goals? Well, their goals is ultimately control. Because they're attempting to create this sense of self that's like a godlike sense of self. And they don't want anyone to challenge it. They don't want anyone to prove that it's an illusion. So therefore, they want to control everybody so that there's no challenge to their sense of self or their worldview. And in order to do that, they have created a lot of ideas that are simply based on a duality consciousness. Some of them are very subtle, very clever, but they have also taken some valid ideas and distorted them. Because, of course, as I've been explaining, there are spiritual beings in a higher realm that are working with Earth, seeking to liberate us from the duality consciousness and help us walk the path to higher and higher states of consciousness. And these beings, I call them ascended masters, they have given, over time, various spiritual ideas. And the dualistic beings have been taking some of these ideas and trying to pervert them. Trying to give them a little bit of a coloring, a little bit of a shading, so that instead of getting people to the real goal of spiritual growth, they get people to go into a blind alley. And this has unfortunately also happened with the concept of non-duality. And especially when it comes to free will, because if you're wanting to control other people, you can, of course, seek to attain this through physical control. That's why you see, for example, in the Soviet Union, they had the Gulag in Siberia, and anybody who opposed the state would be sent there, or they would be executed. Many dictatorships execute anyone who opposes the dictator. That's physical control. But the dualistic beings have also attempted to control people in their minds, because that's much more efficient if you can make people believe in something that makes them controllable. And obviously, if you can make people believe that they don't have free will, they are very easy to control. Because what's going to prevent you from being controlled by these dualistic beings? You have to make choices. You have to make a choice not to accept either their physical control or their emotional and mental control. You have to be discerning and see that here are some ideas that are designed to control you. I'm not going to accept that. And you can only do that if you think you have free will, because if you think you don't have free will, you go into a passive state of mind where, well, things just happen. Things just happen. Right? So what I'm saying is, concept of non-duality is meant to liberate us from the dualistic state of consciousness. But the dualistic beings have taken this concept, they have given it a subtle twist. And one of these twists is, as I said in the previous videos, this misinterpretation that as soon as there's differentiation, there's duality. And this then leads to the idea that your sense of self that you currently have is a separate sense of self, and it's not real, it's based on an illusion. And because your self is an illusion, it's also an illusion you have free will. But as I try to explain, How did you ever get out of a non-dual state of awareness? Was it something that just happened to you, or did you make a choice? If it just happened to you, there's not much you can do about it, right? It's a totally pacifying view. So you're at the mercy of what? However you see it. You know, as I've said, there's some of these non-dual teachings that say that infinite awareness limited itself as us, then forgot it was infinite awareness. So the ultimate spiritual growth is to reawaken to the fact that you are infinite awareness, and therefore you supposedly disappear as a separate self. There's nothing in between. There's either a separate self or infinite awareness, or Brahman. But this is a misinterpretation, deliberate misinterpretation. I'm not here pointing the finger at any particular teacher. It's not my goal to point out any particular teacher. I'm just pointing out that there are these beings in the higher realms, mental and identity realm, that are putting out these ideas that are twisted so they take you in the wrong direction, take you into a blind alley. Because if you believe that you don't have free will, what can you do? How can you walk the spiritual path? How do you walk a spiritual path? You have to make choices. How do you study a spiritual teaching? You had to make the choice. You had to make the choice to continue to study. You had to make a choice to embody the teaching, to internalize the teaching, to live it rather than just understand it intellectually. These are choices you make. You have to make the choice that you're willing to look at yourself and question your present worldview, as I said in the previous video, and step outside of that worldview and see that there is more to know than what you currently think. This is, of course, what these dualistic beings don't want to do, and they don't want you to do it, because they have projected here is an ultimate truth, and they want you to never question it. And how do you question something? You have to make a decision you're willing to question it, because it's a lot easier not to question it. Okay, so what we have now is there is a group of these beings, many of them not even in embodiment. They want to deny that we have free will. Now, ultimately, these beings, as I said, they have taken their freedom of will to an extreme of saying, I can do anything I want, I can define myself any way I want, and my definition is absolutely right because I have godlike qualities. This is what it says in the Old Testament with Adam and Eve, that weren't allowed to eat of the forbidden fruit, because then ye become as gods, knowing good and evil. That means you define what's good and evil, and that's the essence of the duality consciousness. Now, so this is this one group of beings. Then you look at the majority of the people on earth. And many of those also don't believe we have free will. And why is that? Because they don't want to take responsibility for themselves. They don't want to take responsibility for the choices they make and the consequences. And this is to a large degree because they have been deceived by these dualistic beings into believing that they are powerless beings. So we have a very small group of beings, embodied and disembodied, who are exercising power and control over others. And they have managed to pacify most people so that they submit to that control. And they don't question it. And once you submit to this control, it's just easier. You see this if you study dictatorships, for example. You can see it in the Soviet Union, where people just gave up. They didn't question the state. They didn't question the system. There's nothing we can do about it. You can see in Russia today, with the war, many people don't want to talk about it, don't want to question it. They don't want to think about it. Oh, they must know what they're doing. You can see many people in the West who have the same attitude about the system. So everywhere you find a majority of the population who, they may not be actually denying that we have free will, but they're acting as if they don't. Because the way I was brought up, the worldview I was given, that's just the way it is. No point in questioning it. So this means what? This means that in the collective consciousness, there's this very, very powerful matrix or momentum or beast or whatever you want to call it that wants to deny free will. The elite, they are exercising their free will, but they're denying that the population has free will. So where does that leave the spiritual people? Well, the spiritual people, whether you believe in non-duality or any other spiritual teaching you're following, we are the people who have the potential to change the dynamic on Earth. We are the ones who can bring the Earth forward towards a point where the dualistic beings can no longer dominate and control the population, because the population see that there's an alternative to just submitting to this control. That's our ultimate role in this particular age. We're in a transition phase between two ages, the age of Pisces, the age of Aquarius. The age of Aquarius is meant to be an age of freedom, greater spiritual freedom. And as I've said in some of my other videos, there's an ascended master called Saint Germain who has plans to make this a golden age for Earth. And many spiritually interested people we have embodied at this time in order to play a part in bringing this golden age into manifestation, creating or generating this shift. But how do we do this? Well, we can't do it if we are floating or flowing with the currents in the collective consciousness and doing what everybody else is doing. Because you don't bring change by doing what everybody else has been doing for generations. You bring change by accepting new ideas, by taking actions that other people are not taking. So how are we going to do what the collective consciousness and the dualistic beings don't want us to do? Well, we have to make a choice to do something different. And how are we going to make that choice if we deny that we have free will? It can't be done. So I have talked in several of my other videos about the fact that we have a life plan. Before we come into embodiment, we make a life plan, what personal growth we want to have in this lifetime, and what positive impact we want to have on the planet. Of course, when we come into embodiment, we forget that we have made this divine plan. Many of us, because we're spiritual people, we have remembered parts of it. We have had these intuitive glimpses, we've had this intuitive sense, something I need to do, something I need to study, I need to go here, I need to go there. So we have often followed our divine plans to a large degree. But it is possible that we can get sidetracked, or we can even come to the point where we deny certain aspects of our divine plan. And that's where we have to be very, very careful and look at the spiritual teachings we study and follow, that they don't undermine the divine plan that we ourselves made before we came into embodiment. And how do they undermine our divine plan? Well, one way is to pacify us, or to take us into a blind alley, where we think what we're doing is very spiritual and we don't need to question it. And this is what I see has happened to some people who have gone into these teachings of non-duality. Because you have two elements there. You find them in many other spiritual movements, but you certainly have these two elements. First of all, non-duality is the highest possible spiritual teaching. Well, if you think you have the highest possible spiritual teaching, first of all, you don't need to question it, right? Because it's the highest possible, so there couldn't be anything to question. Second of all, you don't need to look beyond it for a higher teaching. It couldn't be if this is the highest. So now you're trapped. You're stuck. You're not going to go beyond it. I saw this same thing in my first spiritual movement, in my second spiritual movement. I've seen it in many other spiritual movements, whether they talk about non-duality or not. You have the highest spiritual teaching, so you don't need to question it. And some people don't need to question it because they are where they need to be. But many people do need to question it because in order to fulfill the higher levels of their divine plan, they have to go somewhere else. They have to look at something else. I'm not telling you what that is. I'm just saying you can only know, but you can only know if you're willing to question your present approach to spirituality, your present spiritual teaching. And if you think it's the highest, well, how are you going to question it? And if you think you don't have free will, how are you going to question it? Because you had to make a choice to question something. Now, spiritual people are generally starting to awaken from this Maya illusion coma that most people are in. So you look at most people on earth, and I said, why do they deny or ignore that we have free will? Because they don't really want to make choices. They don't want to take responsibility for making choices. So we who are spiritual people, if we are to have a positive impact on the earth, we have to dare to make the choices that most people don't want to make. But if we allow ourselves to be ensnared by some spiritual teaching that says we don't have free will, how are we going to do that? How are we going to fulfill our life plans? So why is it that spiritual people can come to deny that we have free will? And it's because there's a couple of reasons for it. The first reason is this, what I've talked about in some of my breakthrough videos, the dream of the automatic path, the outer path. And this is most clearly seen in the fundamentalist Christians. If I declare Jesus to be my Lord and Savior, then Jesus is contractually obligated to come and save me after this lifetime. Take me to heaven. Just because I've said, Jesus, you're my Lord and Savior. This is the outer path. But there are many other versions of this. There can be versions of, if you do enough meditation, if you prostrate yourself on the floor 10,000 times, if you do enough decrees to the violet flame to transmute your karma, then you're automatically going to be saved or ascend or however you describe it. So this is the automatic path. You do outer things. But this is just camouflage. This has nothing to do with spiritual growth. Because spiritual growth is what? Spiritual growth is looking at yourself, your own psychology. As I said, why are we not in a higher state of consciousness? Because we have created all of these subconscious selves in reaction to our experiences on earth over many lifetimes. And those subconscious selves are based on duality. They can never enter the spiritual realm. You cannot ascend, reach nirvana, however you call the ultimate goal of spiritual growth. You cannot reach that goal through these subconscious selves or as long as you have them in your emotional, mental, and identity minds. It cannot be done. You have to get rid of them. But the only way to get rid of them is to take responsibility for yourself and say, I am responsible for my sense of self. And if that sense of self is to be transcended, I am the one who has to enter the process of bringing that about. And in order to do this, I have to make choices. Because the separate selves, the subconscious selves, they don't want you to make choices. They want you to continue doing like a robot what you always have been doing. It's like a mouse running on a treadmill. This is what the separate selves want you to do. Over and over and over again. React the way you always reacted. And you have to decide to break that reactionary pattern. And that requires a conscious decision. In fact, it requires many conscious decisions. And if you are not willing to make those decisions, you're not going to fulfill your spiritual potential in this lifetime. You're not going to get the personal growth you wanted to have. You're not going to have a positive impact on the planet. You're just going to sit there and be pacified. You'll neither add to or detract from the growth of the planet. And you, of course, have a right to make that choice. I have made a different choice, and so have many people I met on the spiritual path. So what I'm trying to say is, why do we as spiritual people, who in a sense have started to take responsibility of ourselves, why can we still be tricked into denying that we have free will? And you cannot understand this unless you understand that there are these dualistic beings who want to retain their control of the earth. And these beings know that the biggest threat to their control of this planet is spiritual people who awaken from duality. So they will do everything they can to prevent us from awakening from duality. And it's a very elaborate apparatus they've created to prevent this. But in relation to free will, here's what they've been trying to do. They have been trying to create such difficult conditions on earth that it's almost impossible to do something that doesn't have some kind of negative consequence. You look back at history. Imagine yourself. You are probably not old enough to have been embodiment during the Second World War. So if you were born after the Second World War, it is not impossible that you could have been affected by the Second World War. You could have been a soldier who got killed. You could have been a civilian who got killed. Whatever it might be. So such a traumatic experience causes people to be afraid of consequences. You know, you see so many very terrible consequences on earth. And then the dualistic beings have created this very elaborate apparatus that is meant to take this fear of these terrible consequences and link them to your personal decisions. So that many people have come to think that there are really no good decisions to make. And these dualistic beings have created so many situations in life where there's so much conflict between people, there are no good decisions to make. You look at the world and see how many groups there are that have conflicts. I have talked about Palestinians and Jews in Jerusalem. There is such a state of conflict that if you log into this conflict, there's no decision you can make that doesn't have very unpleasant consequences. And when you have experienced this over many lifetimes, you can come to a point where you almost don't want to make decisions. Because whatever you do, it leads to some kind of disaster, or at least as to how you feel it. So I can recognize in myself, when I first found the spiritual path, I had this. I don't know exactly what the trauma was from my past lifetime or several lifetimes, but I can look back and see that I had this. I was afraid to make decisions. And when I made a decision that led to a situation where it seemed like I had made a mistake, I was very, very hard on myself. I really came down on myself. And I've seen this so many spiritual people I met. We are so hard on ourselves. We are not nearly as critical of other people as we are of ourselves. I can see that for myself. I thought, you know, if other people made a mistake, well, they just made a mistake, you know, what's the big deal? But if I made a mistake, no, that was terrible. I shouldn't have made that mistake. And where does this come from? Well, it comes from the dualistic beings. Because they have projected out, ever since they came to this planet, they have projected out that there is a standard against which everything should be measured. In other words, every time you make a decision and experience the consequences, there is this standard for perfection. And if the consequence of your decision was not perfect, you were wrong. You had made a mistake. You had sinned. You are a terrible person. You have no right to be here. You should crawl into a hole and die. This is what they projected out. And this is part of why most people don't want to make decisions, but it has especially affected us because those who are spiritual people, the dualistic beings, they target us directly. They try to manipulate us into situations where we make a mistake, and then they try to get us to feel so guilty about it that we don't want to make mistakes anymore. And this is an enormous trauma for many spiritual people I met. In fact, I've met very few people, spiritual people, who had overcome this trauma or who had never experienced it. I'm not sure there is anybody who hasn't experienced this trauma in past lifetimes. And for myself, gosh, it took decades to overcome this. There were so many other problems I had to overcome first, of these separate selves, as I call them, and it took a long time. I'm not even sure I've fully overcome it. There's still, once in a while, something crops up. You made a mistake. You shouldn't have done this. Why did you do this? So this is what the dualist beings have been trying to do. And then they have also tried to create this impossible situation where if we start looking at what is it in our psychology that either causes us to make mistakes or causes us to feel we've made mistakes, we don't. In traditional psychology, there's no way out of this. And in many spiritual teachings, there's no way out either. Because all you can do is meditate more and it'll automatically disappear, or invoke more spiritual light and it'll automatically disappear. But the reality is that these separate selves were based on a decision we made in a past life. And they will only disappear when we come to consciously see that decision, see it's an illusion, and let it go. Let go of the illusion. And many people, it can happen spontaneously if you're willing to look at yourself and observe yourself. So many people have done this. But you can also enter a systematic process for doing this, which you can find a lot of information about in my books and on my websites. The higherawareness-psychology.com website is all about this. So there is a systematic path where you can free yourself from it. But if you haven't done it, you still have this reluctance to make decisions, because if you don't make the perfect decision that has the perfect outcome, you go into this wound that goes back many lifetimes, and it overwhelms you emotionally. I can look back at my own life and see how, if I made a mistake, I was like, oh, it was such a pain in my heart. It was like, gosh, I couldn't do anything. I was paralyzed for some time. And then you have to go into this trying to explain why you did it and why it wasn't so bad, and trying to justify it. You can go round and round in circles, thinking about the situation over and over again, instead of just looking at it and say, oh, well, so what? So what? And this is the difference, really the difference between people who are still trapped in duality and people who have started to escape duality and see themselves as connected beings. Because if you're trapped in duality, you can't bear this pain that you have made this terrible mistake. And you can only think of it in dualistic terms, that either it was perfect or it was a mistake. So then you go into this, as I said, creating more and more convoluted explanations for why it wasn't a mistake or why you aren't bad after all. If you're a connected being, you don't need to look at it in terms of it was a mistake or it had to be perfect. You just say, oh, I got something back from the cosmic mirror that isn't really what I want. So how can I change it? Oh yeah, I change what I project out. So I look at my own state of consciousness, not to find fault, not to condemn, not to judge, not to put myself down, but to see, how can I improve? How can I transcend this? How can I transcend this self that caused me to do what gave me this consequence? It's a fundamentally different approach. You go from a deficit approach, high-risk approach, to a positive, self-reinforcing spiral of doing better and better. Not in a dualistic way of it's either perfect or it's wrong, but you're just higher and higher where you feel more and more free, more and more relaxed, more and more non-attached to what you're getting back. But again, going through this process of freeing yourself from this heavy burden that has been put upon us by the dualistic beings, it requires you to make choices. It's not going to happen automatically. And if you believe in some of these non-dual teachings that say you don't have free will and you don't really exist, you cannot start this process, because these teachings essentially are saying, at least as I can see it, that you just have to sit around and wait for infinite awareness to reawaken itself in you, and then your suffering will be over. And the reason why they say this is that they have this dualistic view. There's the separate self and there's infinite awareness. There's nothing in between. And what the Ascended Masters are saying is, yes, there is something in between. Because the separate self is not who you really are. The separate self is not what was created by infinite awareness or Brahman. The separate self is something you created when you made the choice to go into duality and use these dualistic illusions to build this sense of a separate self. And because you did it by making choices, you can undo it by making more aware choices. This is the fundamental difference. And so, what is in between Brahman or infinite awareness and the separate self? Well, first of all, when you step outside of the separate self, there's the conscious you, as I've called it. And this is what many spiritual teachers, including many non-dual teachers, for example, Muji, talks about the witnessing awareness, where you're not judging. Is it right or wrong? Is it good or bad? Was it a mistake or was it not a mistake? You're just witnessing. You're just seeing, observing, neutral. You are in what I call a neutral state of awareness. So this is the conscious you. But if you go one step up from the conscious you have your higher self, your I am presence. And that is a being in the spiritual realm that decided, made a decision, made a choice, that it wanted to experience itself in this unascended sphere on planet Earth. So it sent the conscious you into embodiment. And there is free will in the conscious you, as there is a higher level of free will in the I am presence. Now, where did the I am presence come from? Well, it was created out of spiritual beings, ascended masters, who out of their own beings manifested your particular I am presence and my particular I am presence, probably by some other ascended masters. And so if we go up, we can see that there's a whole hierarchy of ascended masters that goes up through many different levels, all the way to the creator or Brahman or infinite awareness. So there is a kind of like a huge level, many levels between us here on Earth, which is a very low planet, and the highest level of consciousness, the creator consciousness. Now, as I've said, we can walk up through all of those levels and reach the creator consciousness, but we cannot switch instantly from being a separate self to being infinite awareness. It just isn't realistic. But this is one of these misunderstandings that have crept in. I'm not pointing the finger at any particular person, but it comes from these dualistic beings who want to derail you from walking the path that you decided in your life plan that you wanted to walk in this lifetime. And so you have to really be careful here by, again, I'm not telling you to listen to and accept what I'm saying. But neither am I telling you to listen to and accept what some of these non-dualistic teachings are saying. I'm telling you, go within, listen to your intuition, but be aware that the only way to get accurate intuition about a topic is to be neutral about it. Because if you are very attached to some dualistic view, you can't hear your intuition. It's the still small voice within that will not violate your free will. And if you have what the Buddha called an attachment, or what some Buddhists call, clutching your ideas, clutching your opinions, you can't hear your intuition. You can't hear your higher self. And this is another effect of this. You go into this state of consciousness where you think, now this outer teaching is the ultimate teaching. So I just have to focus on that. I don't have to listen to my intuition because I have the ultimate teaching. But you see, there is no ultimate teaching on earth. The ultimate teaching for you is what your higher self tells you from within. So the question is, can you hear your higher self or not? And the more attachments you have, the more subconscious selves you have, the more attached you are to your worldview, whether it's non-duality or something else, the less you can hear your higher self. I don't care if you hear me or not. But I do think that it would be better for you if you could hear your own higher self. And so I hope this can give you some impetus to start listening and start becoming more and more neutral instead of holding on to these ideas of how the universe is supposed to work. Because the universe doesn't care whatsoever about your ideas. This is one of the biggest breakthroughs on the spiritual path for me, was when I realized that the universe works the way it does, and it doesn't care whatsoever about my ideas that are out of touch with the reality of how the universe works. I can have all the fancy beliefs I want. I can justify them with all of these incredibly sophisticated intellectual arguments. Doesn't mean a thing. It doesn't mean a thing. The universe doesn't care whatsoever. So the fundamental choice we have between duality and non-duality is that in duality, We are projecting a mental image of how we want the universe to work. When we see ourselves as connected beings and walk the spiritual path, we are gradually overcoming all these mental images of how we think the universe works, and we are connecting to the reality of how the universe actually works. And I hope this can help you start that process. You probably already have, but you can always become more and more conscious of it.